When women give birth, there are some of the companies that give penalties to women because they need to constantly think about their kids, take care of the kids. They will not be able to, focus on their work.
If we thought that the world was going to be positive, and I do think that this is an outlook, an outcropping of our beliefs, our spiritual beliefs. If we believe that God is in control and ultimately wants us to have children, then we would go ahead and start having children. But if we're looking at the world as it is, it's all doom and gloom, the sky is falling, all that kind of stuff like that. Why would you want to have children? Hey, grace and peace, everybody. We're back. You saw the thumbnail, you saw the title. Let's talk about a topic that you may or may not have talked about with your children or those young adults around you in your church community or in your family. Why are Gen Z not having children? This is such an interesting thing. I've not thought about it. I'm sure there's a lot of different complexities and reasons. We're going to check out this young brother right here that kind of unpacked it. So let's get at it. Let's go.
What do the Gen Z stare and the decision to not have kids have in common? Well, at first, nothing. One looks like a social quirk, often attributed to a rude personality by the older generations, while the other feels like a huge, life-altering decision. But they're both symptoms of the same issue. A generation that's increasingly hesitant to engage with a world that feels unstable, overwhelming, and difficult to navigate. All right, to be honest, I don't know if the Gen Z stare is anything more than an overblown social media trend, but what I do know is that most of Gen Z doesn't really give a shit about having kids.
So I want to jump on that real quick. And I don't think that it's just that the world is unstable. I think the nihilism experiment that has been pushed out there in the world, that the world is doom and gloom, that there's nothing positive to look forward to. There's nothing to look forward to past your own generation, literally past tomorrow, so to speak, has brought us to this place where people don't see the future. They don't think about having children. And I've said this before, like just pay attention to your normal run-of-the-mill television shows. If you watch an hour of television, 2 hours of television, pay attention to the commercials. Notice how many commercials that don't have children in them, but they have animals. They got your cats, your dogs, your birds, your goldfish, but they don't have children in them. Why is that? Because they don't think about the future anymore. People have the nihilism that, the world is coming to an end. There's nothing positive in the world at all, has brought us to the place where we don't actually think about the future in a positive light. Let's go.
Business Insider survey, only 27% of 18 to 26-year-olds said they saw starting a family as an important goal to achieve in the next 5 years. Is this really just selfishness brought on by smartphones and social media, or does having kids require a society that does not feel like it's going to implode at any second? I'm more inclined to think the latter, but let's try to answer those questions in this video. Let's ground this essay on a singular idea, one that through this video, I'll try to prove to be true. The desire to have children, though partially a personal choice, is a reflection of the world people think they're bringing them into. And if you...
and I agree, there we go, right there. I didn't even see that part. Real quick.
Though partially a personal choice, is a reflection of the world people think they're bringing them into.
If we thought that the world was going to be positive, and I do think that this is an outlook, an outcropping of our beliefs, our spiritual beliefs. If we believe that God is in control and ultimately wants us to have children, and I'm going to bring up a couple of slides, a couple Bible verses that talk about that, then we would go ahead and start having children. But if we're looking at the world as it is, it's all doom and gloom, the sky is falling, all that kind of stuff like that. Why would you want to have children if you don't think that the world's going to be here tomorrow? Let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
And if you zoom out for a second, this actually isn't just a Gen Z problem or an American problem. Birth rates have been declining across most developed countries for years now. In the United States, the fertility rate has fallen to around 1.6 births per woman, well below the replacement level of 2.1. If you aren't familiar with what the term replacement rate means, it's essentially the average number of children each woman needs to have for a population to sustain itself without shrinking over time. Countries like Japan and South Korea are seeing even bigger declines, with South Korea hitting a record low of 0.72, the lowest in the world. Across Europe, the trend looks nearly identical. The EU's average fertility rate sits at about 1.5, with many countries continuing to trend downward.
And I think also we got to factor in health. We have to factor in longevity of life. We have to factor in, of course, the cost of living. I would love to see how this lays against the cost of living and salaries as well, because I'm certain that those things also play a big, huge role in people deciding to have children. As Charlie Kirk would say, have more kids than you can afford. Like now these people are like, look, I'm going to have a whole lot fewer kids. Because look, man, we went from 3.5 children in 1960 to now basically less than 2. Looks like 1.5 in the U.S. That's crazy. And these declines are huge, man. Italy has less than 1.5 kids. That's wild, man. Really wild.
So clearly something universal, something structural about the reality we now live in is reshaping how people across the world think about one of the most fundamental decisions you can make. And while most video essays I've seen on this topic come from American creators and focus primarily on US statistics, I think it's more interesting to look at a place where the fertility crisis is at its most extreme, South Korea. What is it about South Korean society that makes people not want to have kids? Because if we can understand a society experiencing the sharpest decline in the world, the reasons the rest of the world is heading in the same direction start to become much more vivid.
All right, South Korea. All right, let's go check them out. I wonder I really am kind of wondering. Let's go. Let's see how.
Firstly, let's look at their economic situation. The median price of an apartment in Seoul has surpassed 1 billion won, or roughly $750,000 USD. To understand why housing prices have climbed so much, it helps to look at a framework economists use called the de Pasquale-Wheaton model. The de Pasquale-Wheaton model describes a feedback loop between demand, supply, and expectations using this complicated-looking 4-quadrant model. If anyone with an economics degree wants to go into detail as to what each one of these quadrants means and all the lines and the numbers and stuff mean, you can feel free to do that in the comments. But essentially, all you need to know is it's basic supply and demand. When demand rises faster than supply, prices go up. And when people expect prices to keep going up, they rush in to buy, which pushes demand even higher. In South Korea, several forces are pushing in the same direction. Low interest rates have made borrowing easier, demand has surged, particularly from smaller households, and supply hasn't kept up. Normally, rising prices would incentivize more construction, but in Korea, strict redevelopment regulations, especially in dense urban areas, have slowed that construction. Also, zoning constraints like the floor area ratio, which limits how much can be built on a given plot of land, are actually tighter in cities than in surrounding suburbs. That runs counter to what you'd expect in a country aiming for dense transit-oriented growth, but it helps explain why supply hasn't expanded enough yet to meet demand. And because of this, South Korean landlords are moving away from a unique part of their housing market, something called chonse. It's a lease system where tenants pay a massive upfront deposit, sometimes 60 to 80% of the property's value, and then live rent-free for a couple of years. It worked during periods of higher interest rates because landlords could invest that lump.
That's crazy. So 60 to 8% of the value. So they said it was $700,000. So that would be somewhere in the ballpark. Yo, okay, that's absolutely crazy. I didn't know that they did that. Okay, let's go.
Son and earn a return. But today, with lower rates and weaker returns, chonse is falling out of favor. The government has promised more supply, like 170,000 new public housing units a year, with 70,000 coming from urban regeneration schemes, but they haven't been able to deliver on expectations. This creates a negative feedback loop where expensive housing makes it harder to form families, and a lack of families makes future housing policies harder to plan. Not being able to afford a home, to have kids, to allow them the space to mature properly is one of the biggest barriers that's stopping young people from having them. And
I keep saying it, man. These new apartments that they're building, these new communities that they're building, they don't think that they're going to be kids there. I've said that here in Atlanta. Most of the apartment complexes, most of the communities that they have don't have playgrounds because they don't expect kids. Now, of course, not a lot of kids are out playing like they used to. I got you, but they don't even expect for them. They do have dog parks though. So they do expect something. They expect dogs. They don't expect kids.
A lot of these issues are mirrored in the U.S. The median home price in the U.S. has climbed to around $420,000, more than double what it was just a decade ago. At the same time, mortgage rates, after sitting near historic lows during 2020 and 2021, increased past 7% in recent years, dramatically increasing the monthly cost of ownership even if prices stabilize. And supply hasn't kept up either. The U.S. has been estimated to be short around 3 million homes, which might take an entire decade to solve. By that point, the oldest of Gen Z will be pushing 40, like me. And a large part of that comes down to zoning, just like in South Korea. In many major cities, single-family zoning still dominates, making it difficult to build denser, more affordable housing, even in areas where demand is the highest. At the same time, returns in the housing markets are becoming less predictable. The rapid appreciation seen during the pandemic years has slowed, and in some regions reversed, which makes housing feel like an even bigger financial risk. If anything, the smartest financial play right now is actually renting a house. The cost of a home is roughly 40% higher than the cost of renting one in the US. And while that might seem positive on the surface, like, yeah, you don't have to take care of maintenance and all that stuff.
I don't like that, though. I think you should still own a home. Like, the ownership aspect of it cannot be overlooked. And owning something is way better than renting, leasing, borrowing something any day of the week.
I would argue that most people don't think about having kids in a large space where it would just be rented, where they don't actually even own the home. And there still is a problem of there not even being enough homes on top of that. But even if more housing was built, it doesn't necessarily mean that Gen Z could afford it. Moving back to Korea, the average starting salary for a young professional sits closer to 30 to 35 million won per year, around 22,000 to 26,000 USD. That's roughly 35 to 45% of their income going to housing, which is well above the 30% affordability threshold that's recommended. And that's not even considering how many hours Koreans work on average. According to the OECD, Korea ranks number 4 in hours worked per year, reaching close to 1,900 hours. But this is just what is documented. Wow. Their work culture is also extremely strict, which leads their working hours off the clock to rise to times larger than recorded.
In Korea, leaving work on time can actually feel awkward. There's a word for it. 칼퇴. 칼퇴. 칼, knife. 퇴근, getting off work, means leaving work exactly on time. But here's the problem. In some workplaces, if you do 칼퇴, people might look at you like, why are you leaving already?
It's not too much of a different story here in the US. We're behind South Korea in amount of hours worked by roughly 70 hours, but most Americans, or you know what, most workers for that matter, can attest to always being available to work outside of working hours. Whether it's a Microsoft Teams ping late at night from your manager or a project with an unrealistic deadline, you're likely going to be thinking about work or doing work very often outside of working hours. And when your entire life revolves around work, which I would argue is the case for most people right now with a job, what time do you have to think about having and raising kids? Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. You might be thinking, oh, Cole, well, people had to work day and night hundreds of years ago, and they still wanted to have children. Well, yes, but they were also moving through a dramatically different world. If we rewind the clock over 100 years, we can see that most people's primary purpose for having children was tied to labor. In the United States, by the late 1800s...
I don't know about just to labor, but remember, we didn't have Social Security back then either, so... having a big family also meant that you established somebody who's going to help take care of you as you got older in your years, because you had 8, 9, 10 kids, versus now we have Social Security and you don't even have children to keep on living after your retirement.
It's estimated that around 18% of children between the ages of 10 and 15 were part of the labor force, working in factories, mines, farms, and mills.
It's true.
The children yearn for the mines. And on farms, children were an economic asset. Census data from the early 20th century shows that around 70% of children aged 10 to 15 were employed in agriculture, often within their own family households. Having more children was quite literally an investment. But today, that dynamic has completely flipped. In South Korea, the average cost of raising a young child now sits around 1.1 to 1.4 million won per month, or roughly 800 to 1,000 USD, depending on age. The price of basic infant goods and childcare services have also risen, in part due to declining birth rates. This also creates a negative cycle where companies raise prices on childcare-related things to maintain their profits, which drives costs higher, which further disincentivizes the normal person from having children. In the United States, we're already seeing something similar. Recent estimates put the total cost of raising a child at around $300,000 to nearly $400,000 from birth to age 18, not including college. Childcare alone can run well into the tens of thousands per year, in some cases exceeding rent or mortgage payments. On average, families are now spending over 20% of their income on child-related expenses, a number that has been steadily rising in recent years. When something this fundamental becomes that expensive, people stop asking, how do I make this work? And they start asking, is this even a life I want to involve myself in. And when more people start asking themselves the latter, it starts to affect everything downstream.
And I do agree. I understand the young man's position. I think he makes a valid point, and young adults nowadays definitely have a different world than what we live in. But just something to remember, Psalm 127 and 3-5, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior, children are in one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. And it's just something to take into account. Not trying to minimize the plight of Gen Z or this group right here, but be fruitful and multiply is what we were told to do by God. So having not just having a family, there's so many more benefits to having a family. And sure, you're gonna be thugging it out. Sure, it might not be sunshine and rainbows. Maybe you're not gonna be living the Instagram social media life, but there's going to be so many more benefits, in my opinion, that far outstrip the negatives. I can't think of a negative that I've not been willing to accept with having children and having a family. A full house of joy. Psalm 128, 3-4. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoots around your table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. I don't see a downside in this, and even with Deuteronomy 6 and 7, and these words that I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, knowing that you're helping the next generation by giving them the wisdom, giving the insight, giving the things that you've learned, of course, from the scriptures, as well as just from lived experiences. I don't see a downside in that. I don't see what the downside is. That Malachi 2:15 says this: did he not make them one? And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. That's the point. The whole point of this activity of being fruitful and multiply is to have godly offspring, to better the next generation. The only way we're going to better the next generation or in the future after us is by having more people here to do it. If there's fewer people, it's not going to get better. Just my thoughts. Let's go.
Where we have to look past the economic sphere and into the cultural one. I've often talked about this ongoing dating crisis that's been happening here in America as a result of many different factors. Social media paints perfected portrayals of relationships that skew people's perception of what a healthy relationship should look like. Influencers give conflicting advice about how to attract a partner and what red and green flags to look out for, which sets unrealistically high expectations about how an imperfect human should behave in a relationship. And women have more financial autonomy, which can make them more selective. And at the same time, many men are struggling to adapt to these shifts. Most of this applies to other developed countries as well. But in Korea, women have taken their dissatisfaction with men a step further through something called the 4B movement. The 4B movement is a feminist response to the overwhelming cultural pressures and economic disparities in South Korea. According to the OECD, South Korea has the largest gender wage gap among developed countries, with women earning roughly 30% less than men on average. And beyond wages, women are still expected to take on the majority of childcare and domestic responsibilities, even when working full-time.
When women give birth, there are some of the companies that give penalties to women because they need to constantly think about their kids, take care of the kids. They will not be able to, focus on their work.
Korean women can see the kinds of freedoms and opportunities that are expanding for women in other parts of the world, and they're growing increasingly frustrated with what feels like a rigid and outdated system. The name of the movement comes from the Korean prefix B, meaning no. The 4 Bs represent what participants are rejecting. Bichulsan, meaning no childbirth, Biona, meaning no dating men, Bihon, meaning no marriage, and Biseksu, meaning no sex. Now, me personally, I find this stuff interesting.
I don't see, again, I think we've allowed the culture and society to infiltrate the minds and the thought processes rather than be informed by scripture. That's some crazy work. No childbirth, no marriage, no dating, no men. No, man, that's crazy work, man. Not like, so what are you going to do? You're just going to compete with men? And then you get frustrated because you're competing with men, and then you wake up when you're 45 and you realize you don't have a man, you don't have any children, you just have a dog and a thriving career. This is crazy work, man. I think that's a setup for women.
But my skeptic radar immediately goes off when I see something this extreme being promoted online. Specifically, I'm skeptic about just how many Korean women actually feel as though they are a part of this movement. I have no doubt that Korean women are facing a lot of the challenges that I just outlined, but how many of them are purposefully abstaining from all four of these things as a form of boycott? From what I could find, the answer is not that many. Most estimates put the number of women actively participating in the 4B movement somewhere between 5,000 and 50,000 people in a country of over 25 million women. And even those numbers are hard to pin down because the movement isn't centralized. A lot of it exists anonymously online. But I think that's what makes it so relevant and interesting. Anyone with a brain will realize that the 4B movement obviously isn't the cause of South Korea's collapsing birth rates. It's an expression of the same pressures that are influencing far more people, just expressed in a more extreme way. I also think this can partially explain why this movement has caught on with so many women in the United States. In the US, women are more educated than ever, more financially independent than ever, and less willing to settle into roles that feel one-sided or unsustainable. In fact, in some major US cities, young women are, on average, earning more than young men now. And when you're aware of that and you're prioritizing your career and your finances, balancing that career with a motherhood can feel like it has these immense trade-offs that right now don't especially feel too appealing. Now, when we shift the focus to men, I mentioned this briefly, but men seem to be having a tough time adapting to this new world. If women are more selective, it can make the average guy feel like he's never going to be exceptional enough to attract the sort of woman that he could in the past. And from what I've observed, if the world isn't opening up enough opportunities for the average guy to do that, then many will resort to anger or isolation. You know, now men have men going their own way, which is a movement in response to feminist movements like the 4B movement, where men swear to never marry a girl because of how modernity has changed women. We also have a lot of dudes who are scared of how they'll be perceived if they go up to a woman and ask them out and try to pursue them and try to show interest in them because of other stories that have been shared online of other men who have done this and have done it poorly, or they've just been reported to have done it poorly. And it kind of makes men feel a little bit uncertain as to whether this is a good thing to do. And not only do many men now feel like the amount of effort is not worth the potential pain, but the replacements that are available to them, which aren't a good replacement for true love or a real relationship, still allow them to suppress that anger and dissatisfaction, like dirty websites, which are so ubiquitous and easily available. And we haven't even really talked about the overall sentiment that young people have about the direction that the world is heading. Of course,
right. And to the point that he's going, I do think that there's definitely something there. There is a frustration. There's a yin and yang. Women do more, men get more frustrated. Women get more frustrated with men, so men do less. I think there's probably a vicious cycle there. No question, no doubt. The problem is we've lost focus on our first of all, where our value comes from. We've allowed culture to shape our values, and it's culture that isn't downstream from scripture, but rather just whatever we make it up to be this Tuesday. So let's finish this up. I think this is really good, though.
Social media tends to amplify negative events and tragedy while downplaying more positive developments, which can make the world feel worse than it actually is. Yeah. And I don't doubt that perception, rather than objective reality, influences people's decision to not have kids. But also, like, the world is objectively not too awesome right now. It makes sense that Gen Z might be asking themselves, is this really a world I want to bring a kid in on top of everything else we've already discussed? So you see, across the world, the cultural, societal, and economic landscape is constantly reinforcing the idea that kids don't really make sense right now, even if they do bring an immense sense of joy and purpose to one's.
Man, I really appreciate that young brother sharing that. And it's very insightful, but I want you to hopefully leave from here with some hope that, you know what, we don't need a revolution. We don't need to turn the world upside down in that regard. What we need to do is get back to God's design and plan. Be fruitful and multiply. I mean, sure, in this day and age, it's different than when I got married. Sure, it's very different than when your grandparents got married. I understand that part. But getting married, building a family, growing a family, and bringing more little humans into the mix is only a better thing. It's only a good thing because there's so many good things that come from it. Sure, that might mean that we have to make some drastic changes with our financial policies and our housing policies and understanding those things. Absolutely. Our education is going to be changed, but isn't it for the better? Let me know what you think about it down below. Give me all your thoughts and comments. I really am looking forward to hearing what you think about it. So jump on down into that comment section. There's a video popping up on the screen somewhere here that YouTube thinks is going to be very beneficial. So check it out. Let me know what you think about it. Until next time, everybody, grace and peace. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the JWhit Podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, please do me a favor and hit me up with that 3-piece special. Like the video, subscribe, and of course, share it with somebody who would also enjoy this type of content. And make sure you leave a comment because I do pin the best comments to the top. So thank you so much for tuning in today. And until next time, everybody, grace and peace.